Okay, guys, back to the sad truth with unbelievable guests today. I'm really, really happy to have found a way to convince Dan Ariely to come on the show. For those of you who don't know Dan, let me just mention a few of his accolades. They're very long and it will take probably about 50 minutes just to cover them. About 150 scientific articles, 26,000 plus Google Scholar citations. For those of you who don't know what that means 26,000 books or papers or other manuscripts have cited his work. That's quite an extraordinary number. Numerous best-selling books: Irrationally Yours, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, The Upside of Irrationality, Predictably Irrational, and his latest, which is coming out in November, Payoff: The Hidden Logic That Shapes Our Motivation. And perhaps most puzzling, and maybe you'll mention this, one of the few academics who has not only one PhD, but two. How you doing,
I,
that? How you doing, that?
I thank you for the compliments, but two more odd things to add to this is one is I participated in a movie. I was the co-producer of a movie on dishonesty.
And how is it that I was not invited, given my movie star looks, to be part of the
That's
movie?
that's right. So it's called Dishonesty: The Truth About Lies. It's on Netflix now.
I think I might have watched a few minutes of it while huffing and puffing on the elliptical. Very, very good movie, actually. Let's start with what happened with two PhDs. What's the story there?
What's the story? So the story is that I started a PhD in psychology, in cognitive psychology at UNC Chapel Hill, and after a few years, I realized that I want to do more applied decision-making kind of research. And Duke is around the corner, and I take a couple of classes, and I meet one of our mutual friends, Ziv Carmen, and we start working together. And then I have Danny Kahanman invites me to come to New York to talk about some mutual research interest. And lots of people say, you know what, move to a business school. Move to a business school and get a PhD in business, and then you could do more applied work that psychologists don't seem to appreciate. At the time, which is quite a while ago, psychology was all about memory and some language and memory. Now it moves to neuroscience, but they said there's no room for people who want to do a bit more applied work. So I applied to some PhD programs, and I decided to stay in the area. So rather than stop my PhD, I was just getting my master's then, but rather than stop my master's and move to a different program, I decided to stay enrolled in the PhD program at UNC and start a new PhD program at Duke. The two places are not too far
Right.
from each other. I decided not to ask permission of whether this is permissible or not. And I was just enrolled. So I started at UNC. I had 2 years of overlap between the two. Then I had a couple of more years at Duke. It was actually a great deal. First of all, PhD life is great. Why not extend it by a few years? And doing two PhD thesis is just like doing a couple of more papers. If you're going to do it anyway, it's a good deal. So I had a really good time, and I'm very happy that I had the chance to have this training.
Nice. Well, I was going to say that we're still PhD students, so to speak, except that we make a bit more money, right?
And we don't have the same amount of time.
And we don't have the same amount of time because it's also, I'll tell you a quick story. One day I walked into one of my doctoral committee members. He's a famous statistician, and I walk into his office, and I was a doctoral student, and I sort of start to complain about the pressures that I'm facing, and he clearly looked as though he was not impressed or empathetic with my pleas for empathy. So I looked at him and I said, "Well, how come you're not sharing any?" He goes, "Well, guess what? It's only going to get a lot worse than whatever you're facing now. So suck it up and stop whining," or something to that effect.
Something,
And
yeah. In terms of time, yeah. Yesterday I had meetings from 8 in the morning until 10:30 at night, with 1 hour break in the middle. It's a great, it's hard to complain about having so much to do, but the one thing it's only self-inflicted.
exactly.
But one of my general problems in life is how to say no to things. So as a PhD student, I think it's a little easier because you have your thesis and you focus on it, and there's some wonderful bliss about focusing on something. And then later on in life, you get much more busy. There's many more things to do, and people like me who have a very hard time saying no, end up doing lots of things but just by slices,
Right.
rather than spending a month getting engrossed with something. So I miss that a little bit. Maybe it's a little bit like the feeling of falling in love when you're 16, that you kind of fully embracing something and fall head over heels, and you can't think about anything else. I miss that feeling of not spreading myself across many things and just focusing on one very specific thing.
So in light of what we're talking about now, I actually had a question for later in our chat, but I think it's maybe more appropriate to ask it now. So what are some things, given now that I guess you've been a professor for almost 2 decades, what are some of the things that you love most about being a professor? And if any, some of the things that you dislike?
So, I love the university as a system. I think this idea that we have a bit more time to think and to focus and to try and do something compared to industry, for example, I think it's a wonderful blessing. So my research lab, we call ourselves the Center for Advanced Hindsight. We do four things. We look at financial decision making for the poor, trying to understand what people are doing, what they're not doing well, trying to go into financial institutions and help them do things better for the poor. We're looking at healthcare, mostly at things that we can touch, right? So how to get people to exercise more, eat better, take the medication, and so on. We have a set of projects in Africa that are also around financial decision making and health. And then we are engaged with some startups, and we're trying to take our own ideas and create technology to bring it out. And we invite some startups to come and hang out with us for the year. But the nice thing about the university is that we're more patient. I think it's perfectly fine to do a research study, to do it correctly, to take the time. It takes, one of our recent studies took us 3 years, right? Industry will never have the time or the energy for this. So I like that patient part of the university. I also love the energy of the students. So this last weekend, for example, 10 days ago, I showed the students our dishonesty movie. And this last weekend, we had a marathon of short documentaries where the students came on Saturday morning. We gave them cameras and microphones and so on. We taught them a little bit about movie making. We had a producer and director of our film here from New York, and then they went and filmed things. There was a festival in Durham, so there's lots of people around.
On any theme, or is it specific to the theme of your course, or how do they choose?
Anything about dishonesty.
I see, okay.
Anything about dishonesty. So some students went around and asked people how tall they are, and then they showed them they had a measuring tape and actually measured them and talked about that. Some people talked about white lies. Some people talked about self-deception. I mean, lots of wonderful things. And then they filmed on Saturday, edited on Sunday, and Sunday night we had a little short movie. Everybody showed their movies. So, and it was just great to have the undergrads doing kind of 48 hours of really working very hard to try and come up with a movie and so on. So there's something wonderful about the energy of the university as well. So all that is good. And in my current position at the university, I also have the benefit that I can try new courses. So for example, in the spring, I'm going to teach a class on top of spring break. It will be a 5-day class, only 5 days, but 10 hours a day.
Wow.
So the plan is in the morning to meet and have a lecture and discussion about the topic, then get the students to go ahead and collect data about something, come back, analyze their data, get some conclusion, have another lecture in the afternoon, and then in the evening meet on hot chocolate or whiskey or something and discuss what are the implications of these results for society at large. So I think there's lots of wonderful things about the university. I think the downside of the university, and there's some of those, of course, as well. So there's lots of little details to worry about. I think the real problem with university is the cost, and the cost of university is going up, not so much because faculty get paid more, it's because running a big institution is just more expensive for everything, right? The regulation is more expensive, and healthcare is more expensive. And if you want a chemistry lab, 20 years ago you could have a chemistry lab for $20. Now it's hard to have one for less than 30, 40, 50 million dollars. So if you want to study biology now, you need access to huge amounts of computation. So everything is becoming more expensive. And I think we really need to worry about what does it mean about education, right? If somebody wants to be a student in biology, and training in biology and DNA sequencing and so on is going to be this expensive, what is the model of education? Is it just going to be accessible by the wealthy? Should the state get into it in a very different way? So those are the questions that really bother me about the future of education.
Well, one of the good things about Canada, I suppose there are many bad things, but one of the good things is that, if I give you a sense, since you were talking about how expensive it is to go to university, when I did my undergrad and my MBA at McGill University, and I think I paid $440 a semester to go. So that it's 6 years probably for about $5,000-6,000 cumulatively.
Yeah, yeah. But then business school is rather cheap, right? That's because you don't have labs and facilities and so on. But on top of that, by the way, the U.S. of course has a very expensive healthcare.
Right.
So now a university with 10,000 people, somebody has to pay for all this healthcare for everybody. So I think the question is, how do we give top-notch education on scale to lots of people in a way that is good for society? Is something I don't have an answer, but I think it's something we need to worry about.
Now, I had this question also for later, but it seems apropos to mention it here. Are you seeing any of some of the sort of political correctness gone amok, trigger warnings and safe spaces and microaggressions? Have you seen any of that stuff in the context of your own teaching?
So I'm not very politically correct.
Okay, good.
I had a couple. I often use examples from. There's some topics where I talk about examples from romantic life to try and understand our relationship in general, right? Because romantic life is such a kind of a basic part of life, both romantic and sexual life, such a big part of how we function in a deep way. And I use those as starting points, right? So you say, we have relationship at work, but what are some of the fundamentals that might be similar to the way we deal with romantic life, for example? So sometimes I get comments that I'm using too much like stereotypical male and female relationship in my example, and people would have liked to have more varied example. But that's about it. The one part is that Aline, who used to be the lab manager here, used to ask me to tell her my jokes before I go on stage because she wanted to.
She had to clear them for you.
Yeah, she had to clear them for me, and I think jokes are kind of an interesting way because it's very hard to tell jokes that are not offensive to anybody, and I think people do get extra sensitive from this. I've managed to offend some people with jokes in ways that I haven't done with my talks, but with jokes, yes.
I gave a talk this past February at the University of Ottawa on how political correctness and the thought police is stifling the free exchange of ideas on campuses and so on. And I led off with cases of very well-known comedians, stand-up comedians, who no longer do university campuses precisely because of political correctness. And I mean, these are really, really famous guys, Chris Rock and Jerry Seinfeld and so on. Because as you correctly said, it's almost impossible to, state a joke that isn't going to somehow, quote, marginalize and hurt the feelings of somebody. And so they no longer do it. It's complete lunacy.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to try and figure out kind of what is a reasonable trade-off, and how do we, um, if you think about humor as a mirror for society, um, it could be fine to say let's just, I don't want people to go on the street and offend me as being Jewish or Israeli or uh, whatever they decide to do. It's unpleasant. There's no question about it. Um, but I think that we need to be able to put a mirror up to society and say, here's the things that we are complaining about and we want to think about. And comedy is not a bad way of doing it, but we need to agree that that's a reasonable form of criticism and thought. And journalism should be the same way, when we should, in a respectful way, say, here is my point of view, and I'm not cursing you and I'm not offending you, but here is something that really bothers me about the way that these things are happening. And if we crush the ability to have a discussion, I think that's just terrible.
Well, humor, especially when it's done in a self-deprecating way, could be viewed as an honest signal of actually how confident you are, right? If I can make fun of myself,
Yeah.
then ultimately that is signaling that I'm quite right. Yeah, I'm overweight, sure, and let's make fun of that a bit. By the same token, if we extend it collectively, cultures or religions or societies that are unable to withstand humor and satire are ultimately signaling that their belief systems are profoundly weak because they can't withstand the scrutiny of satire. That's why in many religious contexts, satire, humor is forbidden, right? And
Yeah.
so that exactly speaks to your point. We should be able to make fun of ourselves and of others, as long as you said we're not doing it in a malicious way. Everything is fair game. Let's move on now to some scientific work that hopefully will excite the audience. Let's start with your latest book. Tell us about it. It is the hidden logic of what motivates us. Give us sort of the big snippet and then maybe some examples from the book.
Okay, so the big issue is kind of human motivation, and I think there's kind of two things that we get wrong. We get wrong pleasure and we get wrong money. So what do I mean by getting pleasure wrong is that we have this notion of the pleasure principle, that people try to maximize pleasure and avoid pain. And of course, there's some truth to it. Um, but if you look at human achievement and motivation, and you look at what people do day to day, it's not easily described by just trying to avoid pain and achieve pleasure. I mean, every day you'll probably get more pleasure staying in bed than going to the office, getting drunk and working hard at night. You would not see people trying to break records in the Olympics. You will not see artists working very hard. You would not see scientists staying late in the lab. So there's this notion of pleasure that people find work aversive and they seek pleasure, that I think is wrong. And what we need to do is to understand more broadly all the things that we're trying to do, how we strive for meaning and accomplishment and competition and a sense of contribution and so on. As one example, I was in San Francisco a few weeks ago and I talked to a startup. And one of the questions I asked them is how often they stay at work after 10 p.m. And one of them said that yesterday they all stayed after midnight. And I said, how did it work? And he said, one of the team members, she had something that she had to finish and she needed to stay late, and everybody else stayed to help her. And I said, and how did it work when you called home? And they said, I called home, and if I called home and I told my wife, I'm staying home at night because I want to finish my project, she would have said, come and put the kids to bed. But I told her not that I needed it for myself, that I was helping my team member. And all of a sudden it was perfectly fine. Now, if you think about it, it suggests that a part of our motivation is how much we care about other people, that there's something very tribal about work, and our motivation is partially about our progress and so on, but partially it's about our commitment to our coworkers and friends. The second part that people so the part of the book is basically saying, let's just write a motivation equation that tries to capture all of those different elements, and I try to elaborate on some of them, like meaning and competition and completion and a sense of progress and so on. The second part is really about our misunderstanding about money. And because we have this theory that work is aversive and people hate working, we say, how do we get people to work? Well, we just need to give them more money. We need to do bonuses, or we need to pay in a particular way. But it turns out that paying in a particular way doesn't always help. Sometimes it even hurts. And we have very naive ideas about the relationship between money and how things work. And I'll give you one example. So we did a study with a big hotel chain, and these were people in the call center. And what's nice about the call center is you can quantify how productive people are, how many calls they take, how much they sell, how many problems they solve, and so on. And those people were getting about a third of their income from their bonuses, right? So it's substantial. And this company gave us their data, and what we saw was that the same people were getting the bonuses every week. The same people were getting the bonus every week. So you could come up with lots of hypotheses. You could say, these are the good people. These are the people who care about money. You could say these are the people who got bonuses one time and then they start loving bonuses. They don't want to give them up. You can think about nepotism. You can think about these are the people who get good shifts. You can think about all kinds of things. So we convinced this company to give us the performance data every Friday and for us to allocate the bonuses. And what did we decide to do? What algorithms we decide to run? Random. Why? Because we want to disassociate payment from performance and see what actually causes performance to go up and down. Of course, we didn't tell people that that's what we were doing. And what did we find? For example, if you take the top performers and the bottom performers, we found out that giving bonuses to the top performers did not change at all their performance, while giving bonuses to the bottom performers did. Why? Because for that particular job, there were some people who were just good at their jobs. Like imagine you're a good singer and I pay you a little bit more and a little bit less. What, would you sing out of key all of a sudden?
Right.
Of course not. So some people have good phone mannerism. They enjoy talking on the phone. They're doing all these things good. And you pay them a bit more, a bit less. It doesn't really matter. They just do it the way they want. There are other people who are not that good at their job. They're not enjoying it. They couldn't figure it out. And you give them bonuses, they're actually motivated. So in motivation, you want to want to do the work, to want to do better, to want the money, but you also have to be able to improve your skill, your performance. And in this particular case, there was no room for improvement for the top people. Now, just to be clear, our recommendation wasn't to stop paying the top people money, right? They deserve to get paid well, but we said, let's pay them in a different way. Give them a different title, pay them a higher base salary. If the bonus doesn't work, don't use bonus, because bonus also has a downside and stress, right? Together with it. And think about which are the people that are actually benefiting from this. And another example for this, I was approached recently, actually 2 years ago, I was approached by a foreign government to have a discussion with their Ministry of Finance. And their Ministry of Finance had a mechanism to try and improve teachers' quality. And their idea was to go to each school, identify the top 10% of teachers in each school, forget how they would do it, but they had a method of doing it, and give bonuses to those 10%. Now think about the theory that underlines this idea. What's the theory? All the teachers are lazy. They all know what to do, but they just don't want to do it. We'll need to give them a bonus, and now they'll be motivated. And not only that, all teachers need to think that they can be in the top 10%. Because if you're bottom 20% now, when you say, I can never reach the top 10%, this bonus will not work on you. So this Ministry of Finance had a very simplified and clearly wrong view on human motivation, and they approached in a very simple way, and they wanted to implement this system. And one of the most interesting studies ever in improving quality of schools was a study in which they took the top 10% of the teachers, not 10%, but the top teachers, and gave them time to teach the not so good teachers. Right? What's the theory there? The theory there is teaching is hard. It's just not clear how you do it. But some people have figured it out. Let's take the people who figured it out and let's give them time to help the other people. Now, if this Ministry of Finance got to do their program, what would happen? For sure, the top teachers would not help anybody, right, because they would try to protect their territory. Right. So with money, I think in bonuses and payment, we have some very naive ideas about how money works and how motivation works. And because of that, I think there are many cases, and I describe more cases in the book, in which we think that we're actually improving motivation, but we're actually destroying motivation.
Gotcha. Let me weigh in both on what you just said and also more generally on your other sort of behavioral decision-making work, not just to you, but in general to the paradigm. So there's a distinction which I and other evolutionary folks talk about, the difference between proximate explanations and ultimate explanations. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that distinction. So, much of science operates at the proximate level. How does something operate? What are the factors that affect it? And, everything that you've described is within proximate world, and that's fine. Most Nobel Prizes are won at the proximate world, and that's great. Of course, what evolutionary theory offers us is epistemologically an extra layer of explanation, the ultimate why. And ultimate, as I found out through giving lectures with my marketing scholars, they misunderstand this to mean as ultimate meaning superior. It simply means ultimate in the Darwinian sense of unfolding the causal explanation. What is the Darwinian why for why our motivational system is built the way that it is?
Yeah. And by the way, it doesn't have to be evolutionary. There's just lots of different levels
of explanations.
And you can stay closer to the data, and then you have the comfort that you're close to the data, and you feel comfortable that you're as close as possible, and then you can start generalizing and thinking about broader and broader principles. And I think kind of evolutionary theory is one of the mechanisms, but every time we come up with an explanation, you can say, but why?
Right.
And then you have to go another level of the onion, and then a layer, and then another why, and another why, another why. And I think you're right that, of course, people in evolutionary psychology are more, their comfort level with explanation is at a higher level than myself.
Well, I don't think it's a question of comfort level. I think it's a question of having a more complete explanation for any given phenomenon involving biological agents, right? So we could spend 40 years, as we've done, demonstrating that Homo economicus is wrong and that normative rationality is wrong in the following very clever ways. And I think that research is fantastic, and you're one of the leaders in that. And, the experiments that you do are brilliant. But then we could simply add richer understanding of that phenomenon if we say, so why have we evolved these particular departures of this form of rationality? So we could then talk about ecological rationality, which contextualizes rationality within an evolutionary understanding of how the human mind would have evolved. So then my question to you is, because I know that you've done work, for example, your journal Behavioral Decision Making with Lowenstein, where you do sexual arousal and sexual decision making, has several citations that sort of recognizes these evolutionary influences. So why either you and or other folks who are rooted in the BDT paradigm have not as much looked to, an evolutionary layer of explanation? Is it just you're just not interested, or are some folks?
No, So I'll give you my answer, which is, I don't want to take responsibility for other people, but my answer is that on one hand, it's clear that we're evolutionary creatures and evolutionary forces have created us. And when we think or talk or discuss things, evolution clearly comes into it, right? Even when we talk about something like loss aversion. So loss aversion is the idea that we hate losses more than gains.
By the way, I discuss exactly loss aversion from an evolutionary perspective in a forthcoming JMR paper. Go ahead.
Okay, good. I'm also, because I've been studying pain for a long time, I've been thinking about the fact that it's really easy to create pain in the lab, very hard to create pleasure, right? So pain, like infinite amount of pain you can create with electrical shocks and pressure and you name it. Pleasure is kind of, you can give people money, you can give them food, you can give people, sexual gratification, but it's not the same. I mean, we have this sensitivity to, and you can argue that the reason nature got us to pay more attention to pain than to pleasure is that if we make a mistake, nature can kill us. I mean, the payoff is minus infinity, right? You eat poison, you do something wrong, you're done. Whereas having something successful just buys you another day or another hour. So there's a very high asymmetry. So you could say maybe nature wants us to avoid the dangerous stuff for sure.
To put it, sorry to interrupt you, to put it even more succinctly, the negativity bias is adaptive, basically. That's what you're saying, right?
Yep. Yeah. And so you can argue this. So I think that thinking about life in evolutionary terms is certainly something that I do. The question is, how comfortable are we with the scientific part of this? And this is where I have a problem. So, Darwin has had like how many types of finches? 16, I forget. And he could talk about the correlation between the size of the beak and what they were doing. Or if we think about the animal kingdom and we look at the size of the testicle of the animal and how long the offspring remain, we have lots of different types. With people, we have one type. So it's a little hard. So while I recognize that as being the most likely explanation, an important explanation, and certainly a part for discussion, sometimes I don't feel as comfortable. And it's not true for all research. Some research is not like this. But simply saying loss aversion, I would be very comfortable saying here's an evolutionary possibility. But because I don't see a way to test it.
So let me weigh in. My forthcoming JMR paper is on the methods of EP, and it is exactly written for what you just said. Basically, the idea is that I'm glad that you mentioned Darwin, because what Darwin did, although he didn't use those words, is he used what are called nomological networks of cumulative evidence to make an adaptive argument. In other words, it's not a single datum that demonstrates that an adaptive or an evolutionary argument is right. Rather, you build a nomological network. In the context of humans, you do that in a multiplicity of ways. So let me just give you a few ways. You could look at children who are in the pre-socialization stage to rule out that it's due to socialization. You could look at across cultures so that you establish that it's a human universal. You could look across time periods using radically different cultures. You could look at medical data, physiological data, genetic data. Yeah. So there are all sorts of ways where you could take an adaptive argument, and then when you find a multiplicity of lines of evidence that it's impossible to then argue that that argument is unassailable. As a matter of fact, if you are a good evolutionary scientist, you typically set your thresholds of evidence profoundly higher than other sciences. So what you're saying is true in that many people will make an evolutionary argument off the cuff and stop there. Yeah. But in terms of the epistemology of evolutionary science, it exactly does what you argued correctly Darwin does. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. And I think there's just a question that it's not a good fit with people who do experimental science in a standard way.
Right.
Because experimental science has two conditions, and we can see who's right. And making an argument in another way is just a very different way of doing it. So I think that's one of the challenges. The other challenge, I think, is the statistics that we're using. So I think we all want to be Bayesian statisticians, and we all want to say, what did we believe? And here's a new evidence, and let's update. And every piece of evidence is good. Even if you're an experimentalist, you would say, experiments really changed my opinion. Talking to one person changed it by a tiny bit. Getting a case study changes by kind of bit. But the moment we have kind of just experiments, and that's the only criteria, and we don't think of the process of accumulating data, it's about proving versus disproving. And yes. I think that's one of the challenges. And what we really want to move is to a more belief updating approach that says, what did you believe in? here's a new piece of data. You tell me how much you trust it, right? The elephant has a testicle of this size, whatever it relates to. Or people do the following thing. And now, don't just say, I ignore it completely because it's not an experiment. You can't just say it's either an experiment, which I give it 100% value, or it's not an experiment, which I give you 0. And how much do you update it? So I think that we will get to something more general, where we will think about a way to aggregate lots of pieces of evidence. And by the way, just about my own kind of lack of integrity in a way, until not too long ago, I was just doing experiments, right? And but nevertheless, when I write, I use lots of case studies.
Right.
I say, here's a story about a guy who found black pearls and did the following thing and got them to do it, and I find it convincing. And so there's no question. And even when we write papers, right, we cite things from literature and we cite cases and so on. So we are saying we have this scientific approach, but we do understand that when we write or communicate or think or even make sense of something, there's lots of path to get more data. But I think the real question for the simple scientists like myself that do simplified experiments is, how do you integrate the experimental data with non-experimental?
So let me just add 2 more things, and then we'll move on to something else. So in my paper, because it really speaks to what you're saying. So in this JMR paper that's forthcoming, I talk about these nomological networks of cumulative evidence. I also talk about, I use the sequential sampling model that was originally first developed by Abraham Wald, where he's talking about, sampling is not a fixed, it's itself a random variable. So when we're going to decide whether we're going to accept or not reject or a hypothesis, it's really a question of how much sampling do you need to cross that threshold. And that actually was something that I used in my own doctoral dissertation. And so I use that principle at the epistemological level to argue that this is exactly what evolutionary scientists do. What you're basically saying is, here is the threshold of cumulative evidence that I need to acquire before I can tick off that my adaptive argument is a good one. There are very clear epistemological criteria. And so I will get content analysis data and medical data and experimental data and survey data and cross-cultural data. And once that cumulative evidence crosses that threshold, then I can safely say, it's always provisional, right? Science is provisional, but I can almost say with certainty that that adaptive argument becomes unassailable. So I think I'm really glad we're having this conversation.
I'm not sure unassailable, but you could say we've made the argument.
We made the argument. Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
You want to be more conservative. So I think that's really a good conversation to have, because I think some of the hesitation of people who are otherwise, obviously very sophisticated academics are precisely those that you're raising. And so hopefully that's good. Okay, good.
I want to say one more thing about this, because, as I do more and more applied work around the world, I find that sometimes I have a very hard time convincing some institutions to do the randomized control trial. Like, we're doing something now in Africa when we're trying to get very poor people to save money in a health wallet that only approved clinics could take money from there. And the problem is that if you're very sick and you have no money, you're not going to go to see a doctor, and then you might get sicker and so on. And we're trying to accelerate that. And we can come up with a design with the 20 conditions that we want to run with all the control conditions, but it's very hard in good faith to say that's what we need. And I think basically and basically kind of finding a way to say, okay, we'll have these conditions and we'll have this other method of collecting data, and eventually we'll end up kind of trying to figure out what happens, but we're not going to rely only on randomized control trials. I think is a very important approach. I just don't know how to do it in kind of the standard journals yet. But I think you're right that we need to come up with some kind of standards to do this, and if we do it, will be great.
Oh, wonderful. How do you decide I mean, I went through your Google Scholar and I looked at your papers. One of the first things that I love, I mean, obviously, other than you're incredibly productive, is that you are one of those guys that, in a sense, is after my own heart because you are truly interdisciplinarian, right? For example, consumer psychologists like to talk the big talk about, it's interdisciplinary, but most of them come from marketing departments. Most of them publish in 3 or 4 journals. If you don't publish in those 3 or 4 journals, then the research somehow doesn't exist, right? Origin of Species doesn't exist because it wasn't published in Journal of Consumer Research, right? Now, of course, you don't play that game. You publish in medical journals and economic journals and so on. So I guess 2 questions. Number one, how is it that you committed to being such an interdisciplinarian, and how do you choose which particular problems to tackle for your next projects?
So I think I have to admit that I'm kind of not a good academic. So I think that kind of the standard, my standard view of academic is somebody who goes into a topic and try to understand it very, very deeply. So you study procrastination and you do it for 30 years, and at the end of this, you understand.
By that metric, by the way, I'm the worst academic that has ever existed.
I was going to say that, but you. So I think there's a version of academics that are like this. My version is that I try to solve problems. So, I look at the financial crisis. I think that conflicts of interest are a big part of it, and I try to figure out what we can do about it. I was in a slum in Kenya. I see some things about health. I want to do some things about it. So I'm very much driven by trying to take what we know about social science already, plus some new ideas, and try to make a difference in people's lives. And for me, if I have a project that I think would, in 5 years would have an impact on people's life, that's fine. If it's 25, it's just not part of my temperament. So because I'm kind of an applied guy, I think it's I look at the problems. I don't start with the literature. I look at the problems and I say which problem somebody would let me do something on that I can have because if you're trying to solve a practical problem, you need access. You can't just do it in a lab study. So because of that, I do things across domain, but I always start with a problem I want to work on. And even when I get students to come here, I try to ask them 2 questions, like what problem do they want to deal with? I said, give me a domain of life that you want to improve people's lives in some way, and something that you would be personally passionate about. So it's not just something that you think is a good academic study because, whatever reason, but something that if things go wrong and so on, something that is connected to your hobbies and identity, something that you read about in your free time, something like that. So for example, we've been doing all kinds of studies on making saving visible. So actually, I'm wondering about this, your feedback on this. So if you think about a long time ago, we used to save with goats. Somebody got a bit more money or whatever, they got another goat. So you could see how many goats your neighbors have, and you could compete on goats. Now, of course, we don't know how much people are saving. And there was this story in the Atlantic that somebody said that he thinks that men in the US are more likely to talk to their friends about taking Viagra than credit card bills. But now we don't know how much people save. The only thing we know is how much people spend, and therefore we compete on spending. And
so if I understand, sorry to interrupt. So if I understand correctly, there is no signaling mechanism that allows me, but incidentally, that itself could very quickly enter into evolutionary territory, correct?
Of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Yeah, go on.
So you say you compete on the things that are visible. Historically, saving or wealth, you can compete on directly. Now you get spending, which is not necessarily, it's correlated, but it's not necessarily a good indicator of it. So there was a recent study that showed that when people win the lottery, their neighbors start spending more money, right? Trying to catch up. So the question was, how do you get things that are invisible visible. Another approach is to say, if you're the breadwinner of the family, and you decide to save or buy insurance or do something like this, the only thing that the family sees is that you have taken money away from the table. You've bought them less. I mean, they basically see the sacrifice, that you don't get the reward for showing them anything that you've done for them. So we've been thinking a lot about how do you make invisible visible, and actually quite successfully using those approaches got very poor people to save some money, got people to put some money in accounts in this way. So that's basically what I try to do. I try to look at the world, see what problems I want to work on, and if you start like this, you can't help but at the end of the day, whatever you write doesn't. You don't know what journal it would fit when you start.
Right, exactly. One of the first words you uttered when we started chatting was when you were talking about motivation, you mentioned pleasure. And so my approach, if I were to answer the same question that I posed you, is I'm really a cerebral hedonist, right? I don't like to go to the same intellectual landscape every day. And the analogy I use is, even though I love the Turks and Caicos and the Caribbean, I don't want to go there every time because there's so many other places I'd like to visit. And so I view, I'm an intellectual tourist, and I'd like to go visit many, many different landscapes. And if Dan Ariely tells me of a problem today that he thinks we should work on, and it's an exciting one, I'm in. I don't care about strategy. I mean, and I do this to a fault in that I've never been a careerist. I've never been strategizing in how to do and so on. And I say to a fault because there are established rules of what you should do if you're going to be. Yeah. And I just always found that life is too short. This is why I created this YouTube channel, and I have chats with guys like you. I don't make much money. I don't get anything out of it, but I enjoy it.
You use the term cerebral hedonist, which is a nice title. But looking at you from the outside, you could say maybe you're a cerebral masochist. where you seem to find pleasure in getting yourself into trouble.
It's funny that you say this, because my wife always says, why do you always have to pick the toughest, most difficult path? And I think actually it's interesting we're saying this, and I know we have to finish soon because you have to go, but it really comes from a strain of purity. If I don't do the most difficult thing, somehow I've taken a shortcut and I can't. But if I take the most difficult route and I come out on top, then somehow I must be a pure guy. And I think so it comes from there. Before we go, because I know
by the way, just on this, so we've been studying recently Olympic athletes, mostly cyclists, and these guys have tremendous amount of pain, right? Cycling is the same muscle group against friction, very, very hard for hours. And it's so painful that these Olympic athletes sometimes say that they say, I only want to last 30 more seconds. And they count 30 seconds, say, only 30 more seconds. They don't even think to the end of the race. And, if you think about your own life, and you say, how do you define pleasure? Because some of the fights you get yourself into and so on, it's hard to think of them as pleasure, right? It is, of course, but there is a sense of purity and progress and authenticity and driving things, but it's not a pleasure that somebody from the outside would look at you when you're having this fight. You're not smiling when you're doing this, right? So I think going back to this question of what is pleasure, if we look at your own lives and the kind of fights you decided to have and debates and discussion, putting yourself out in the way you've put yourself, it's very fulfilling, and it gives you, I think, you get lots of credit and you think about yourself in a certain way, but it's not a pleasure that you would say somebody from the outside would say, this guy is enjoying every moment. They would look at this and they would say, what is he doing? Like, why not pick something simpler?
There you go. Well, thank you for putting it in, I guess, a nice way for me.
It is a nice way. It is a nice way.
Thank you. As we end, and of course I could keep you here for another 5 hours, but I appreciate the pressures on your time. Are there any projects that people might not be aware of yet that you'd like to maybe mention, other than, of course, your forthcoming book? Is there anything that you'd like to, just
So there's one other thing that we were just releasing. So we created a card game called Irrationally Yours. Called Irrational Game. And this card game, each card has an experiment from social science. We describe it very briefly, and then we have four possible answers, and people try to guess. And then we have kind of on the back, like, what does it mean for society? And so far we had a few people played with the early version of this, and some people said the game takes way too long, but that it's a wonderful way to think about kind of social science and our lives and what do we want to do differently. And they'll give you a personal challenge that I'll send you a game when
that'd be good.
Should be ready in about a month. And maybe you can help us think about some evolutionary cards to add to it.
Well, finally, I could get on your list. I don't think it's there anymore, but you used to have an alphabet of all the authors that you've dealt with.
That's
And
right.
I've always thought that it was profoundly irrational of you that the S didn't have somebody that should be on that list. So
Okay.
maybe we could fix that problem.
Very good.
Thank you
We'll
so
work on it.
Hey, Dan, it was a real pleasure. Stay on the line. I'm just going to end it. Thank you so much, Dan. Real pleasure.